Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is August 13th. Tenochtitlan stood on an island in a shallow lake, in the basin where Mexico City now stands. Population estimates vary, but most scholars place it somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people, larger than any city in Spain at the time. 3 raised causeways tied the island to the mainland, and because the lake around it was salty, the city drank from an aqueduct running in from the springs at Chapultepec on the western shore. That aqueduct was the vulnerability, and by the second week of August 1521, it had been cut for roughly 3 months. Hernán Cortés had first entered the city in November 1519, been driven out with heavy losses in the summer of 1520, and came back in the spring of 1521 to take it by siege. The force that returned with him was not primarily Spanish. Cortés commanded about 1,000 Europeans, with under 100 horses. Around them stood tens of thousands of indigenous soldiers. Tlaxcalans above all, a confederacy the Mexica had never managed to conquer, along with contingents from Texcoco, Huexochinco, Chalco, and tributary towns that now saw an opening. Recent scholarship has pressed hard on this point. The Fall of Tenochtitlan was not a few hundred Spaniards toppling an empire. It was a regional war among Nahua states, in which the Spanish supplied ships, steel, horses, and a foreign disease, and their allies supplied the army. Inside the city, the ruler was Cuauhtémoc, whose name joins the words for eagle and descent. He was in his mid-20s by most accounts, and he had come to the throne early in 1521 because his predecessor, Cuauhtémoc, died of smallpox after ruling roughly 80 days. The epidemic had swept the basin the previous autumn, killing an unknown but enormous share of the population and stripping the Mexica of experienced commanders before the siege began. By August, Cuauhtémoc governed a fraction of his own capital, the northern city of Tlatelolco, its great market, and the houses packed around it. Everything south of that was rubble. Cortés had ordered 13 brigantines built at Tlaxcala over the autumn and winter, small sailing ships laid down some 60 miles from the water they were meant to float on. Thousands of Tlaxcalan porters carried the timbers, rigging, and ironwork over the mountains in pieces. At Texcoco, on the lake's eastern shore, laborers cut a canal from the town out to open water so the ships could be assembled inland and launched. Cortés wrote that thousands of men worked at it for weeks. When the brigantines came out onto the lake in late April, they ended Mexica control of the water. Canoe fleets had been the city's great tactical advantage, allowing warriors to swarm the flanks of any column advancing along a narrow causeway. Now the causeway columns had escorts. The Mexica adapted, driving sharpened stakes into the shallows to trap the holes, but the balance had shifted. In late May, the Spanish and their allies occupied the causeway approaches, broke the Chapultepec aqueduct, and began pushing inward. For weeks the pattern was the same. By day, the columns advanced, filling the canal breaches the defenders had opened. By night, they withdrew to their camps. By morning, the Mexica had dug the breaches out again and rebuilt the barricades. The attackers were spending men to take the same ground repeatedly. On the 30th of June, that method broke. An assault pushed too far along a causeway with a canal still unfilled behind it, and the retreat collapsed into a rout. Several dozen Spaniards were taken alive. Cortés himself was seized and pulled free by his own men, one of whom died doing it. Over the following days, the prisoners were sacrificed at a temple, in full view of the army on the causeways. Mexica priests then sent word to the allied cities that their gods had promised the invaders' destruction within days, and many allied contingents went home to wait. When the days passed without it, most came back. Cortés changed his method, and the change decided the siege. He had wanted the city intact. A functioning capital was worth more than ruins. He gave that up. From July onward, the advance stopped trying to hold ground it could not consolidate and instead demolished everything it passed. Houses and temples pulled down. The debris shoveled into the canals until the ground was solid enough for horses and formations to operate on. it was slower and irreversible. Each day's gain stayed a gain. The Mexica could not refill what was now packed with the stone of their own city. Compounding it was the blockade. Nearly no fresh water had reached the island since May. People drank from the lake, and dysentery followed. Food had run out. Survivor accounts describe eating lizards and swallows, then saltgrass of the lake, and the gnawed wood of the coral tree. Whether Cuauhtémoc could have surrendered on any terms he trusted is a question the sources do not settle. He had been elevated by a faction committed to resistance, several of his kinsmen had already died in the fighting, and Spanish offers arrived through interpreters and intermediaries with obvious reasons to be doubted. He refused each one. On the 12th of August, the attackers drove into the last streets still held around the market and killed on a scale that disturbed even Cortés's own dispatch, which claims 40,000 killed or taken in a single day, a figure historians treat as unreliable in the way most conquistador records are unreliable. The next morning the assault resumed. The Nahua accounts, collected decades later by Sahagún's informants, describe a final sortie somewhere in these last days. A warrior sent out in the Quetzal regalia that had belonged to an earlier ruler, who drove the attackers back briefly and took captives before the fighting subsided into silence. Then the canoes went out. Cortés had stationed the brigantines to watch exactly for this. A ship under Garcia Holguin ran down the group carrying Cuauhtémoc, and Holguin and Gonzalo de Sandoval afterward quarreled over which of them was owed the credit. Cuauhtémoc was brought to Cortés on a rooftop in Tlatelolco. In Cortés's own account of the meeting, and in the memoir Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote decades later, the captured ruler reached toward the Spaniard's dagger and asked to be killed with it. Cortés refused. The fighting stopped that afternoon. Diaz remembered that it rained hard that night, with thunder over the ruins. What followed unfolded over several days. Cuauhtémoc had asked that the survivors be allowed to leave, and they streamed out along the causeways. Cortés's letter describes the emaciated, the dead in the houses, and the smell carrying across the water. The Allied contingents took captives and plunder. The Spanish searched for the treasure they had lost during the retreat of 1520 and found only a fraction of it, which produced its own consequence. Early in his captivity, Cuauhtémoc had his feet burned with oil to make him reveal where the gold had gone. Bernal Diaz recorded that the royal treasurer pushed for it and that Cortés allowed it. Little was recovered. Cuauhtémoc survived, permanently injured. He was kept on for 3.5 years as a nominal ruler of a city that no longer existed in its old form. Late in 1524, Cortés took him along an expedition to Honduras, and somewhere in the swamps of what is now Campeche had him hanged, saying a conspiracy had been uncovered. Diaz, who was there, wrote that the death was unjust and that it weighed on the men who saw it. Accounts of the exact date and the place differ. Cortés rebuilt on the same island, using the same stone. The ceremonial precinct came down. The Spanish capital rose over it with indigenous labor, and Mexico City has occupied the site ever since. Tlaxcala secured tribute exemptions and privileges from the crown and spent the colonial centuries insisting, in court after court, that its people had been conquerors rather than the conquered. Historians continue to divide over what weighed most in the outcome. One line of argument emphasizes epidemic disease, smallpox arriving before the siege, killing a ruler and an unknown share of the defenders. Another emphasizes politics, that the Mexica tributary system generated enemies faster than it could absorb them, and that Cortés's real achievement was recruiting them. What the sources do not support is the tidy story that the Mexica mistook the Spanish for returning gods and lost their nerve. That account appears in documents written after the fact, mostly under Spanish supervision, and scholars now read it as an explanation composed backward from the defeat. Cuauhtémoc's name is on an avenue, a borough, and a metro station in the city built over his, ground that is still sinking, in places by tens of centimeters a year, into the lakebed the Spanish drained. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.